When people move from state to state or country to country, they often take pieces of home with them. Now, pieces of home can include things like books or cookware. It may be pieces of family jewelry like this old watch or brooch. Sometimes pieces of home took the form of animals or birds in cages, or seeds from favorite plants. More often than not, the animals and seeds caused no problems, but in other situations, they became invasives.
Nothing makes a place feel more like home than birds from home. Unfortunately, many of the birds that we see most often in North Carolina are non-resident invasive species. Starlings, for example, were released in New York's Central Park in the 1890s by well-intentioned people who wanted to celebrate the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. Now they are among the most abundant birds of North America, often displacing such species as bluebirds and woodpeckers. The domestic pigeon, or rock dove, a native of Europe and North Africa, was first introduced to North America by French settlers in the 1600s. Few birds are as recognizable in big cities and rural America. House sparrows from England established a New York base in the 1850s. By 1900, they had reached California to become one of the continent's and North Carolina's most common birds. The house finch, a native of Mexico and the southwestern U.S., is now firmly established east of the Mississippi after being released on Long Island, New York in the 1940s. Though very familiar and lovely to look at, these birds have displaced many native birds in the struggle for food and habitat. It's easier to dislike such pests as fire ants that arrived through Mobile Bay in the 1930s from South America. Also easy to dislike is the kudzu plant, the Asian vine carpeting our highway landscape. There are many more invaders, especially in the plant community, as I learned from botanist Peter White, professor at UNC Chapel Hill and director of the renowned North Carolina Botanical Garden.
One of the great changes in the North Carolina landscape has been the arrival of species from other parts of the world. Those plants were brought with the earliest settlers to this area. They brought some plants on purpose because they knew them well and used them for various purposes. And some plants were introduced accidentally as seeds on their clothing, on their boots, or with their livestock. As the settlement took place and as the economy of the South grew, we had ornamental plants that were brought from other parts of the world to this landscape. Some of them were well behaved, but some of them began to be invaders of the landscape in general. To a botanist, one of the favorite examples is the ginkgo because it has got such an interesting evolutionary history. It's one of the oldest lineages of trees, of all trees, and yet it was only native. It dwindled down in evolutionary time to a small population in China. It's been spread by horticulturists all over the world, and it's a fun addition to any garden.
Other ornamental favorites that don't spread include the deodar cedar, native to the Himalayas, and the colorful crepe myrtle, a plant native to Asia, first introduced to the southern United States in 1747.
But then at the other end of the spectrum, we have those plants that have come from elsewhere that are highly invasive, that become part of the landscape, but also are capable of reducing the great natural diversity of our own flora in North Carolina. Three of the trees that have invaded North Carolina and now are found in many of our landscapes are tree of heaven, mimosa, and princess tree. Now all three are interesting botanically, and the mimosa has beautiful pink flowers and the princess tree has wonderful purple flowers. But they all are capable of invading natural habitats, and because they're so fast-growing and aggressive and produce so many seeds, they're capable of displacing native North Carolina plants and reducing the diversity of plants in the state and in particular habitats. The princess tree is particularly interesting. each tree can make 20 million seeds, and over the years these come up everywhere.
I asked Peter about another invasive tree species found in almost every neighborhood.
One of the invading trees in North Carolina is the Bradford pear. Now this is an ornamental plant that has been planted throughout the Southeast over the last several decades. It's one of the most widely used trees. Now we found out some bad qualities that Bradford pear has. One is that it has very weak branching structure, so that after ice storms in North Carolina, it's one of the trees, the landscape trees, that sustains the most damage, requires the most care in the home landscape. But we've also found out something more troubling recently, which is it's also an invader. This plant is a horticultural hybrid, and what that means is that it's hiding, in a sense, a lot of genetic diversity which can come out in the progeny.
This simply means that the offspring of the Bradford pear, seen in fields and along forest edges, exhibits some bad features not found in the Bradford pear itself, such as enormous thorns that can pierce canvas or even horsehide. More importantly, the unwanted progeny of the Bradford can displace native trees. We at Exploring North Carolina want to make it clear that many non-native or exotic plants and animals are not invasive. That is, they do not dominate, displace, or disrupt native fauna and flora. We think of some non-native species, such as the European honeybee, brought in the 1600s by colonists, as essential to our ecosystems. Others are such accepted parts of North Carolina's natural fabric that we can't imagine life without them, such as the rainbow trout, brought from California and the Pacific Northwest in the 1880s. Also loved is the brown trout, brought from Europe and the British Isles at the end of the 19th century. To me, however, neither is as beautiful as the Appalachian brook trout, our only native trout. Although rainbows and browns are generally dominant in waters shared with brook trout, few anglers consider them invasive. Peter White told us about invasive trees. Given the chance, I had to ask him about other more famous or more infamous invasive plants in North Carolina.
Two of the invasive vines are kudzu, which is everybody's favorite poster child of the weedy invasive plant, and Japanese honeysuckle. Kudzu is capable of going leaps and bounds and growing many meters per year, and it drapes itself over the edge of forests and reduces forest productivity, and it also tends to increase the breakage of trees and tree branches. The Japanese honeysuckle is becoming part of that landscape and also capable of reducing native diversity. We have a native species of honeysuckle as well, which I think is quite beautiful.
Another vine classified as an invasive is English ivy. Like kudzu, it can drape trees and suffocate a forest floor.
North Carolina also has some invaders, which are shrubs. Two of the shrubs were plants brought to form hedges in North Carolina, along farm edges, but also in people's yards. And those are Russian olive and ligustrum or privet. Now both of these are examples of the worst category of invaders, I think, which are invaders that are capable of changing the way a ecosystem or habitat works. For example, the Russian olive is a nitrogen fixer, and it would seem like a good thing to add nitrogen to the soil, but many plants are adapted to low nitrogen conditions, and those that are adapted to high nitrogen or excess nitrogen put on tremendous size in the presence of that fertility, that added fertility. The privet is an evergreen species which invades some of our bottomlands, which are normally almost entirely deciduous. That is, they're made up of trees and shrubs that lose their leaves in the fall. And it creates a dense evergreen layer in the understory. That dense evergreen layer now creates shade at the ground level through which tree seedlings and wildflowers and grasses and sedges and other native plants are now confronted with this shade layer that didn't exist previously. And that changes really how those species reproduce, and that species is capable of knocking out multiple species of native plants. Invasives include other kinds of plants than trees and shrubs and vines. One grass that is highly invasive in North Carolina is the Japanese stilt grass. Now, this is also an example of one that got here accidentally. It infests backyards, and it's one of the most frequent plants that I hear about in terms of people's home gardens.
Stilt grass is just one of a number of problem grasses. Various species of Asian bamboo are capable of choking out native vegetation. In coastal North Carolina, an invasive grass called Phragmites can displace various cattails and other plants at the water's edge. I wanted to find out from Peter how a plant can be well behaved in its homeland and become an invasive here in the southeastern United States.
Well, the first question is the climate here the same as they've experienced where they're native? And many of our horticultural plants and many of our worst invaders actually come from East Asia, the temperate areas of China and Japan that have a very similar alternation of summer and winter temperatures and the high humidity that North Carolina has. But there are other reasons as well. Among those that are brought over from those areas, some plants grow very quickly and have high reproductive output, but there's a final explanation, which is that many of our worst invaders actually are controlled in their native range by natural enemies.
Unfortunately, we have also unwittingly imported some unseen invaders that have dramatically altered or destroyed important ecosystems.
The invasive species problem is not just the plants themselves, but sometimes when horticulturists bring plants from other parts of the world, they inadvertently bring the very pests and diseases that may control the populations of that plant back in the homeland. Some of the worst invasive species problems are pests and diseases like chestnut blight, the balsam woolly adelgid, the hemlock woolly adelgid, and dogwood anthracnose. Chestnut was a widespread tree in North Carolina, and it produced consistently a very large crop of nuts that were important to wildlife populations and to the settlers and to the Indians as well. The chestnut blight is a fungus from China, which wiped out this majestic and gigantic tree in North Carolina, and this very ecologically important tree.
At high altitudes, you can see the graphic remains of Fraser fir and red spruce forest, ravaged by the woolly adelgid. There is also a hemlock adelgid, probably introduced through nursery stocks, that is now threatening hemlocks across the southern Appalachians. We have seen many common birds and plants that have been classified as invasives. The same is true for some members of our fish community. Exploring North Carolina accompanied fisheries biologists from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission as they sought out non-native fish that have become problems. Chad Thomas took us to the Roanoke River.
It's interesting that a lot of the species that we take for granted have always been here actually are introduced. And one of the good examples of that is the common carp. Common carp were brought into North America through Boston Harbor in about 1877. About 2 years later, over 25 states in the U.S. had some population of common carp. They were brought here primarily for aquaculture, to feed folks and to kind of control vegetation. And now they are widespread basically from the Pacific to the Atlantic. One of the problems with common carp is that they like to stir the bottom up and keep the water real muddy. And this is a problem when you have species that need clean sediments to spawn on. So the carp come in, they're either feeding and pulling detritus and vegetation up off the bottom, so they're actually physically moving earth and then they're stirring it up when they spawn in these large concentrations. So they make the water real muddy, and this isn't always very beneficial. Blue catfish are a very popular sport fish for North Carolina anglers, and they may not know when they pull them up that they're not native to the state. They're actually native to the Mississippi River Basin and some of the other Gulf Coast drainages. But very popular sport fish. They grow very large, and anglers readily catch 60 to 70 pound blue catfish in the different reservoirs and rivers in the state. But the problem is that they are a top-line predator. So if we already have good game fish populations in some of our water bodies, it's kind of dangerous to put another one like the blue catfish in there.
Another fisheries biologist, Keith Ashley, took us to Lake Sutton in the Cape Fear River Basin near Wilmington. We were looking for one of the most aggressive of all invasive fish.
This is a giant flathead catfish, one of many non-native or alien species found in North Carolina waters.
With shocking equipment that does not harm fish, biologist Ashley and his crew showed us some enormous alien fish from our waters.
We're here on Lake Sutton collecting flathead catfish, which were first introduced to North Carolina in 1966 when they were introduced to the Yadkin PD and Cape Fear River systems. Since that time, they have been introduced to 13 of the 17 major river drainages in the state of North Carolina. They were first collected here in Lake Sutton in the early 90s. Flathead catfish are native to the Mississippi, Mobile, and Rio Grande drainages of the Midwestern United States, where they attain very large sizes and are highly prized by some anglers. Flathead catfish are highly piscivorous, which means they eat nothing but fish. And starting at about 10 inches, they eat nothing but live fish, which means they can have a negative impact on the structural composition of a population as the flathead population increases.
Flatheads are not just any ordinary catfish. They can be larger than your children.
I have personally weighed flathead catfish up to 80 pounds. Their diet consists primarily of sunfish, catfish, and shad species. And we have collected largemouth bass up to 18 inches. Flathead catfish are a solitary predator, and they tend to be an ambush predator, where they like to lay up against very large logs or tree stumps and dart out when another fish, such as a sunfish or another catfish, swims by.
Although we may have painted a bleak picture of invasive populations of birds, plants, and fish in North Carolina, there is action you can take. Dr. Chris Moorman of North Carolina State University is an expert in what he calls going native.
Although the idea of a plant being invasive is a relatively new idea, invasive exotic plants have been introduced for the past several decades, even though they were known to be invasive. Because of North Carolina's incredible diversity of native plants from the mountains to the coast, there are also an incredible diversity of options for homeowners to use in their homes and gardens. North Carolina, for example, has over 30 species of oaks that are native to the state. Because there's so many different native alternatives, they're plants that can be used on dry sites or wet sites. They're plants that can be used in sunny locations or shaded locations. They're plants that produce blooms in the spring, and they're plants that produce blooms in the fall. They're plants that produce fruits in the summertime and others that produce fruits in the winter. So there are lots of options for homeowners to use if they want to focus on native plants.
In my own yard, I have identified 9 invasives. I even planted some of them, but I am not alone.
Everybody's played some role in the introduction of invasive exotic plants, from state and federal agencies to landscape architects, horticultural designers. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I often state that the wildlife profession has played one of the biggest roles in the introduction of invasive plants. Historically, biologists recommended known invasive plants like bicolor lespedeza, autumn olive, or multiflora rose. But now that we know these plants can be detrimental in certain ways, it's important to work as a group to promote the native alternatives to these known invasive exotic plants. In your area, visit a local nursery, or go to your county extension office, or search for websites to find out where native plants are available in your area. Even if native plants aren't available, by asking you begin to create a demand, and once we begin to create a demand, then native plants are definitely more likely to be available in the future.
Keith Ashley warns us that moving many invasives is not only ill-advised, but illegal.
The introduction of flathead catfish and other non-native species into any public water body in North Carolina needs to be carefully evaluated prior to their release. In fact, North Carolina now requires its citizens to obtain a permit prior to stocking any public water body with another fish species.
Peter White reminds us that North Carolina is biologically unique for many reasons, and that our natural diversity should be celebrated.
What can we do about the invasive species issue? Well, first of all, everybody needs to learn about it. We need to be able to understand this issue, and when we acquire plants for our gardens, when we go to garden centers, we should ask, is this an invasive species, or is this a species that will be relatively benign in the landscape? So there are ecological reasons that go beyond just avoiding the invasive species problem that would turn our gardening activities and our landscape activities into something that enhances the beauty of North Carolina and also supports animal diversity that depends on that plant diversity. Beyond choosing native plants just because they're an alternative to invasive plants, native plants also have many wonderful attributes on their own. For example, because the native plants of a region are distinctive to that region, it helps to build a sense of place and a sense that every spot is unique and that North Carolina need not look like any other part of the world. It should look like North Carolina.
Exploring North Carolina does not want to turn back the clock on non-native plants and animals.